The first to notice was a little boy playing near the fence. He froze when he saw Minka, the farm's orange tabby, walking across the dusty path with something small and grey dangling from her mouth. At first, he thought it was just another victim of her hunting skill, another life snatched for her collection of trophies. After all, Minka had always been a fierce predator, the kind of cat that could spend hours crouched in silence, eyes fixed, body coiled, until the final leap brought down a mouse or sparrow. Everyone knew her reputation. She didn't just hunt for hunger, she hunted out of instinct. But this time was different. There was something odd in the way she carried this tiny creature. Not triumph, not pride, not the careless swing of a hunter bringing back prey. No, this was deliberate, urgent, careful. The boy squinted and realized with shock that what she carried wasn't a mouse at all, but a baby squirrel, fur thin and soft, its tail no more than a stubby brush, its body trembling with squeaks that cut through the still air. He ran to call the others. Within minutes, 2 farmers and a group of curious children trailed behind Minka as she padded steadily toward the old barn. They expected to see her disappear into a corner, maybe finish her kill where no one could interfere. But instead, she vanished into the hayloft. Hours passed before anyone dared climb up and look. What they found was so strange it made their breath catch. There, in a hollow of straw, Minka lay stretched on her side, her 3 kittens pressed against her belly, suckling contentedly. And nestled among them, squirming weakly but alive, was the baby squirrel. Not rejected, not harmed, not cast aside. She had placed it there as if it had always belonged. The farmers whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Cats and squirrels were not allies. In the natural order, they were predator and prey. This should have been an ending, not a beginning. Yet here it was, life flowing where death was expected. And as strange as it seemed, this wasn't the first time nature had bent its own rules. Years earlier, one farmer recalled hearing of a sheepdog in a nearby village that had adopted an orphaned lamb, licking it, guarding it, letting it follow her as if it were her own pup. In another case, told almost as folklore, a lioness in Africa was seen nursing a baby antelope, protecting it against other predators for weeks. The villagers had dismissed these tales as exaggerations or myths, until now. Because now, in their own hayloft, they were watching the same defiance unfold. A cat refusing to kill a squirrel, instead nursing it to life. The children leaned in, eyes wide. One girl whispered, "She's treating it like her kitten." And she was right. Minka licked the squirrel's head with the same careful strokes she gave her own young. When one of the kittens pressed too hard against the fragile intruder, she shifted her paw protectively, shielding it. It was a sight so unnatural it became almost holy. A creature made for hunting had been chosen instead of its mother. The farmers left quietly, not wanting to disturb her. From that day on, they watched in silence as this strange story began to unfold, one that would soon ripple through the entire village. The barn was unusually quiet that afternoon, save for the low rustle of straw and the soft mewing of newborn kittens. A shaft of sunlight cut through a crack in the wooden boards, falling directly onto the small family huddled in the hayloft. To most, it looked ordinary at first glance, just a mother cat with her litter. But a second look revealed the impossible truth. Nestled among them was a baby squirrel, fragile and trembling, pressed close against the warm belly of the predator who should have been its end. Minka, the orange tabby, didn't seem to recognize the difference. She groomed the squirrel with slow, deliberate licks, her tongue smoothing down its thin fur. Whenever it squeaked too loudly, she pulled it closer, as though trying to quiet it with her heartbeat. The kittens, blind and fumbling, wriggled against Pip, as the children would later name him, and he wriggled back, too small to know he didn't belong. The farmers who had climbed the ladder that day were torn between disbelief and awe. They whispered to each other, their voices low, as though afraid to break the spell of what they were witnessing. "She's treating it as her own," one muttered. "I've never seen anything like it." The other shook his head slowly, crossing his arms. "It shouldn't be possible. It goes against everything." And yet the truth lay in front of them, undeniable. Over the next few days, they watched carefully, expecting the experiment of nature to fail. Surely the squirrel would be rejected, or perhaps starve, unable to feed properly. But each morning, when they climbed to check, they found it nestled closer than before, belly full, tiny body stronger. Pip had been claimed. Whatever invisible thread bound mother to child had stretched across the gap of species and instinct, weaving him into Minka's family. It was not the first time in history that nurture had defied nature, but seeing it with one's own eyes gave it a weight stories could never carry. And stories there were plenty. The villagers began to share them with each other in hushed tones, accounts of animals who had done the unthinkable. They spoke of a dog that had carried home an abandoned kitten, lying beside it through cold nights until the farmer finally took it in. They remembered hearing of a dolphin that had nudged a drowning puppy back to shore, circling protectively until it was safe. These tales, once dismissed as exaggerations or sentimental nonsense, now felt suddenly possible. Because here, in the old hayloft, the same kind of miracle was growing day by day. The children were the most enchanted of all. They would sneak up quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile scene, and watch the little squirrel among the kittens. It learned quickly to nuzzle its way to the best spot for feeding, sometimes squealing with frustration when it was pushed aside, sometimes clinging stubbornly until it got what it needed. And every time it seemed too weak, Minka would adjust her body, making space, as though she somehow knew this strange child required extra care. But more than feeding, there was the way she guarded him. When the farm dog wandered too close to the barn, his nails clicking against the floorboards, Minka's head would snap up, ears flattening, eyes blazing. She leapt from her nest in an instant, a low hiss vibrating in her throat, tail lashing. The dog paused, startled, and backed away. And only when the danger had passed did she return to her litter, curling protectively around them, her paw resting lightly on the squirrel as if to reassure him, "You are safe here." Time moved differently in the loft. Days stretched into weeks, each one carrying small victories that no one had expected. Pip's fur thickened, his tail beginning to puff out in the way of all young squirrels. His eyes opened wide, revealing a brightness that seemed to drink in the world. His legs grew stronger, and soon he was no longer just a passenger in the nest but a participant, climbing over his siblings with awkward enthusiasm, testing his balance on the straw, chirping in a voice that mingled strangely with the meows around him. It was then that the villagers began to realize this story was not just unusual, it was a symbol, a living parable about care that crossed boundaries. "It's as if she doesn't see the difference," one farmer remarked one evening, leaning against the fence. "Kittens, squirrel, it doesn't matter to her. All she knows is that they need her." Another nodded slowly, his eyes following the cat as she slipped out of the barn to hunt. Strange, isn't it? For all our talk about instincts and rules of nature, sometimes it's the animals who teach us mercy. Minka's life didn't change much in outward appearance. She still hunted, still prowled the fields at dusk, still left small offerings on the doorstep as cats do. But whenever she returned to the loft, her entire being shifted. She became the watchful mother again, slipping into her nest with a patience and gentleness that seemed at odds with the predator she was outside. It was as if she carried two natures within her, hunter and nurturer, and she had chosen, at least for this one fragile creature, to let mercy rule. And Pip grew under that mercy. The children adored him, naming him, talking to him in whispers, sometimes slipping bits of food near the nest though Minka kept a careful watch. He learned to nibble, tiny paws clutching morsels of bread or seeds, even as he still returned to his adopted mother for warmth and comfort. He was becoming both squirrel and kitten, belonging to neither world entirely but thriving between them. There was one moment, weeks later, that struck the villagers deeply. Pip had clambered higher up the hay bales, his movements clumsy but determined. He lost his footing, tumbling down in a blur of grey fur. Before anyone could react, Minka had leapt, catching him in her mouth with the same delicate grip she used on her own kittens. She carried him back, setting him down with a soft nudge, licking him until his trembling stopped. And then she curled around him, closing her eyes as though to say, "Fall as many times as you must, I will catch you every time." Word of the strange family spread beyond the farm. Neighbors came to see, marveling at the sight. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others smiled with a kind of reverence. And each person left carrying the same unspoken thought, that perhaps the boundaries we imagine in the world are not always as rigid as we think. Sometimes, the rules of predator and prey, of fear and survival, are interrupted by something stronger, the instinct to nurture, to protect, to love. As Pip grew, he began to test the edges of his little world. He climbed fence posts, clung to wooden beams, darted across rafters with bursts of confidence. Yet always, when he tired or grew frightened, he returned to the nest. Minka never scolded him for leaving. She only accepted him back, tucking him into her side, her purr resonating like a promise. For the villagers, it was more than a curiosity. It was a lesson. They saw in Minka's devotion a mirror of something higher, something that spoke to the stubbornness of life and the strange ways it finds to protect itself. It reminded them that family can be chosen, that care can be given across differences, that survival is not always about strength but sometimes about kindness. And slowly, Pip became more than just a squirrel. He became a story the villagers told to each other on quiet evenings, a story that spread further than they could have imagined. A story that reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the smallest creatures, in the most unlikely circumstances, reveal the greatest truths. As the weeks ripened into months, Pip began to change in ways that startled even the children who watched him daily. His once scrawny tail swelled into the proud brush of his kind, a banner of silver-gray fur that flicked with energy whenever he climbed. His leaps, once clumsy stumbles across straw and fence beams, grew sharper, more assured, more distinctly squirrel. And yet, though his body leaned toward his wild inheritance, his heart still seemed tied to the barn, to the soft hayloft where Minka and her kittens remained his truest companions. The kittens, too, had grown. Their eyes were bright, their paws swift, their curiosity insatiable. They tumbled together in mock battles, pouncing, biting lightly, learning the games of hunters. Pip joined them often, though his movements were odd, his play a mixture of scurrying and darting that didn't quite match their feline rhythm. Still, he was included, accepted as one of them. And if he faltered or grew tired sooner, it never mattered. The kittens curled against him at night, a tangle of fur and breath where no one questioned his place. Minka watched them all with a quiet vigilance. Her independence had not lessened, she still stalked the fields and left her nightly offerings at the farmer's door, but within the barn she was transformed. She was not simply a cat with her kittens. She was a mother in the fullest sense, extending her circle of care beyond instinct, beyond species, into something that even the farmers struggled to name. The villagers, too, grew deeply invested in the unfolding story. They had first come out of curiosity, eager to glimpse the oddity of a cat raising a squirrel. But as time went on, their visits changed. They came not for spectacle, but for reminder that life was full of unexpected grace, that nature was not only red in tooth and claw, but sometimes tender, merciful, astonishingly gentle. One old woman, stooped with years, came often to the barn. She would sit quietly near the ladder, watching Pip scurry about. "It reminds me of something," she said softly one day, more to herself than to anyone else. "Of how love doesn't always come where we expect it. Sometimes it finds us in the strangest places, with the most unlikely faces." Her words lingered, passed quietly among the villagers, until the story of the cat and the squirrel became more than an oddity. It became a parable. By late summer, Pip had grown bold. He tested himself against the world outside the barn, climbing the oak tree near the fence, leaping from branch to branch. His body was built for it, his claws sank easily into bark, his limbs coiled and sprang with power. Yet even in those moments of freedom, he was never gone long. He would dart up into the canopy, tail flicking like a pennant in the breeze, only to return minutes later, rushing back across the fence rail and down into the hayloft, chirping as he nestled again against Minka's side. The farmers shook their heads in disbelief. "He should be gone by now," one remarked. "A squirrel doesn't stay tethered to a barn. His kind live in trees, not in straw." Yet Pip remained, torn between two worlds, as though he could not bear to leave the one who had given him life. And there were moments when his dual identity startled even those who had grown used to him. Once, the children laid out seeds for him near the barn. He clutched them in his paws, nibbling with his sharp teeth, looking every bit the wild squirrel he was born to be. But moments later, he bounded after the kittens, rolling with them in the straw, their playful mews mixing with his chirps. He was neither holy squirrel nor holy cat, but something in between, a creature born of nature's rules yet living by a story entirely his own. Minka never seemed to notice the difference. Her care did not waver, her attention did not falter. To her, he was simply hers. And in her unwavering devotion, the villagers began to see themselves reflected. Had they not, too, learned that family is sometimes chosen, sometimes unexpected, sometimes stitched together from fragments of loss and mercy? Had they not, too, discovered that bonds of love often defy logic, expectation, even blood? The story of Pip spread beyond the village. Travelers passing through would stop to see the famous barn squirrel raised by a cat. Some scoffed at it as luck, others marveled, but all left changed, their minds unsettled by the evidence that life could be softer, more surprising than they had thought. Then came the turning point. One crisp morning, as the air sharpened with autumn's edge, Pip climbed higher than he ever had before. The villagers watched as he scurried to the top of the oak tree, his tail aplume against the pale sky. He paused, gazing out at the stretch of forest beyond the fields, a wilderness that was his birthright. For a long moment, he remained there, still as stone, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. The children held their breath. "He's going to leave," one whispered. And indeed, it seemed as though he might. For at that moment, Pip was no longer the fragile orphan of the hayloft, nor the odd sibling of kittens. He was a squirrel in his prime, strong, fast, ready for the wild. But just when it seemed he would vanish into the forest, Pip did something no one expected. He turned. With a flick of his tail, he bounded down the trunk, across the fence, back into the barn. He darted straight into the hayloft, straight to Minka, pressing himself against her fur. And Minka, unbothered, licked his head once, firmly, as if to mark him again. "You are mine." The villagers exhaled, relief mingled with awe. For whatever voice the wild had spoken, Pip had chosen instead the voice of the mother who had saved him. He would leave eventually, they knew, instinct could not be denied forever. But for now, he stayed, caught between the call of the trees and the comfort of the barn. And in that stay, the villagers saw the deeper meaning. Life is not always a straight path from birth to destiny. Sometimes it bends, twists, pauses in unexpected places. Sometimes survival is not about following instinct, but about following love. And sometimes, against every expectation, the hunter becomes the protector, the prey becomes the child, and the barn becomes a sanctuary where the impossible quietly thrives. Autumn deepened. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the sharp scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The fields around the farm turned golden, the last of the harvest gathered into barns, the earth itself preparing for rest. In the hayloft, life had grown quieter too. The kittens, now sleek and nimble, ventured far beyond their nest, learning the ways of prowling in shadows and chasing after flickers of movement in the grass. Minka watched them with less intensity now, knowing they were strong enough to fend for themselves. But Pip remained the question that lingered in everyone's minds. He was no longer small or fragile. His fur had thickened for the coming cold, his claws curved perfectly for climbing, his tail full and strong, fanning behind him like a banner of independence. Each day he scaled the oak tree with greater ease, leaping from branch to branch as if rehearsing for the forest beyond. And each day he returned, scurrying back down to the barn, to the hayloft, to the mother who had claimed him from death. The villagers began to wonder how long it would last. "He cannot stay forever," they murmured. "The wild calls to him. His kind do not belong in barns." They spoke with both sadness and inevitability, as though watching a child prepare to leave home. Some even wagered on when the day would come, when Pip would vanish into the forest and not return. And yet, there was a quiet resistance in others, a hope that perhaps this story could remain as it was, suspended against the natural order. They longed for Pip to stay, to keep proving that nurture could defy instinct. For in his presence they had found comfort, a living sign that the harshness of nature was not absolute, that tenderness could reign even where it had no right to exist. The turning came one morning after the first frost, when the grass glittered white in the early sun and the breath of the animals rose in faint clouds. Pip had been restless that week, darting higher and further into the oak, testing longer leaps, vanishing for minutes at a time before returning breathless to the barn. But that morning, he climbed to the highest branch yet, his small form silhouetted against the pale winter sky. The children watched from below, their heads tilted back. One whispered, "This is it." And perhaps it was. For Pip stood there, motionless, his eyes scanning the stretch of forest beyond the farm. The woods lay silent, vast, waiting. Something stirred in him then, something no human eye could fully see, an instinct older than nurture, older than the bond of the hayloft. The wild was calling him home. He leapt. Not down, but out, branch to branch, higher, further, until the villagers lost sight of him in the canopy. Minutes passed. The children held their breath, waiting for him to return, waiting for the familiar scurry back down the trunk, back into the safety of straw and warmth. But he did not come. The oak stood quiet, its bare branches swaying gently in the breeze. The hayloft lay empty but for the kittens and their mother. Pip was gone. The silence that followed was heavy. Some of the children cried. The farmers exchanged glances, nodding grimly. "It was bound to happen," one said softly. "He is what he is. A squirrel cannot live in a barn forever." The words were true, but they carried no comfort. For though they had known it must come, they had hoped, foolishly, that love might rewrite nature's story completely. Days passed. Minka went on with her life, feeding her kittens, prowling the fields, returning to the barn each night. Yet those who watched closely swore she seemed to linger at the edge of the hayloft sometimes, her eyes fixed on the oak tree outside, as if expecting to see a small grey figure scurrying back. They said she waited, though she never called. She was a cat, after all, silent, reserved, carrying her truths inward. But in her waiting, they saw a quiet echo of the grief every mother knows when a child leaves, even when it is right, even when it is good. And then, just when the villagers had resigned themselves to his absence, Pip returned. It was dusk when he darted down the oak, his tail fanned wide, his movements sure and strong. He leapt the fence, scampered across the yard, and vanished into the barn. The children, wide-eyed, rushed to the loft and found him there, pressing himself once more into Minka's fur, chirping softly, as if greeting her after a long journey. Minka licked his head once, firmly, the same gesture she had given him since the day she first laid him in the straw. It did not happen often after that, but it happened enough. Pip had moved into the wild, claiming his birthright among the trees. Yet from time to time, he returned, darting down from the canopy, slipping into the barn, nuzzling against the mother who had once saved him. And each time, Minka received him without hesitation, without question, as though no time had passed at all. The villagers told the story for years after, each retelling shaping it into something larger than life. They spoke of the cat who had stolen a squirrel from fate, raising it as her own child. They spoke of Pip, the squirrel who returned to the barn even after the forest had claimed him. And in every telling, the meaning deepened. To some, it was proof that instinct could be rewritten by love. To others, it was a parable of family, how it is not always born in the expected way, but sometimes found, chosen, made from unlikely threads. And to all, it was a story of mercy, the kind that breaks through the hard laws of nature to remind the world that tenderness has power too. Even long after Pip was gone, when the children of that village had grown into parents and grandparents themselves, the tale remained. They told it at firesides, in kitchens, in quiet barns where the air smelled of straw and the moonlight spilled through cracks in the wood. And each time it was told, listeners felt the same stirring of wonder. For it was more than the story of a cat and a squirrel. It was the story of life refusing to follow the script. Of death turned back, of instinct softened, of mercy where none should have been. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes love comes where it should not, Sometimes it holds on longer than reason allows, and sometimes, even after the world calls us away, it still welcomes us home again. The squirrel grew. At first, the changes were small, its eyes opening, revealing that peculiar glassy-look baby squirrels have a mixture of bewilderment and wildness. Soon, it began crawling, first awkwardly dragging itself across the blanket, then clambering onto the cat's fur like she was both mother and mountain. The woman, who watched all of this with silent awe, realized she was seeing a drama play out that most would never believe if she told it. Yet each day was proof that love can forge kinship stronger than bloodlines. It was when the squirrel began to explore that the true test of their odd family started. It darted about the kitchen with nervous energy, sniffing every corner, testing every crevice. The cat, patient as a stone, followed with her eyes. Sometimes, the woman worried. What if instincts returned? What if the cat forgot her role as nurturer and remembered her role as hunter? Yet the opposite happened. One morning, when the squirrel slipped and nearly wedged itself behind the wooden leg of a chair, it was the cat who darted first, gently hooking the baby's fur with a single claw and pulling it back into safety. There was no malice, only maternal reflex. The woman recalled a story from her childhood that suddenly seemed alive again before her eyes. Her grandmother used to tell her that in the village long ago, there was a dog who lost her litter in a storm and adopted an orphan goat kid instead. The villagers laughed at the sight of a dog allowing a goat to drink from her body, but her grandmother's voice always carried reverence when she told it. Creation listens to its maker, and sometimes even beasts of the field know tenderness we forget. Watching the cat cradle the squirrel, she finally understood what her grandmother meant. But not every day was tender. Nature carried reminders that harmony is fragile. One afternoon, a crow landed on the fence. It tilted its head at the sight of the squirrel, now stronger, its fur grown in, tail fluffing into a plume. The crow croaked sharply, eyeing its potential meal. The cat, who had seemed sleepy all morning, transformed in an instant. She arched her back, her fur bristling like 100 needles, and hissed so loud it rattled the woman's ears. The crow flapped away. The squirrel, unaware, pressed against the cat, seeking warmth and safety. For the woman, it was more than an act of protection. It was a declaration, "This one is mine." Weeks turned into months, and the cat's strange child began to reveal both its belonging and its difference. It clambered across cabinets with ease, hung upside down by tiny claws, and once nearly knocked a glass jar onto the floor in its wild scrambling. The cat could not climb after it, but she waited below, her eyes following, sometimes letting out a sharp meow as though scolding her child for being reckless. The woman laughed softly at these exchanges, recognizing the same dynamic she had with her own children when they were young, always climbing, always running where they should not, always requiring a voice that reminded them they were loved but must be careful. Yet the question haunted her: what would happen when the squirrel was grown? Would it return to the wild? Would it leave, forgetting its feline mother? Or would it stay, forever trapped between two worlds, too wild for the home, too tame for the forest? The answer began to unfold one dusky evening when the woman, her arms full of firewood, returned to the yard to find the squirrel at the base of a tree. It had never climbed one before. The cat sat nearby, her tail twitching nervously. The squirrel looked at the rough bark, then at its mother, then back at the tree. Something ancient flickered in its small eyes, something older than nurturing and tenderness, the call of instinct, the pull of a world to which it truly belonged. Slowly, shakily, it began to climb. The cat rose, pacing at the base, letting out anxious cries. The woman held her breath, not daring to interfere. Higher the squirrel went, each movement both clumsy and certain, until it reached a branch and sat there, trembling, gazing down at the cat. For a moment, the entire world seemed suspended. Would it leap into the trees and disappear? Would it abandon the only mother it had ever known? Then, just as suddenly, it scurried back down and nestled once more into the fur at the cat's side. The woman thought of another sub-story then, her neighbor, years ago, who raised a wild hawk from a fledgling. He had told her, with a mixture of pride and sorrow, that one day, The hawk stretched its wings and never returned. "That's the way of things," he had said, though his voice trembled. "Love doesn't cage. It lets go, even when it aches." Watching the squirrel return to the cat's side, she realized she was standing at the edge of the same truth. For now, though, they were still together, an impossible family stitched by instinct, nurtured by grace, and witnessed by the woman who could not help but marvel at the sight every day.